My rich son-in-law accused me of stealing a silver spoon. "Get out, thief!" he screamed in front of the guests. Everyone laughed. My daughter said, "Stealing a spoon? That's pathetic even for you." Out of nowhere, a mysterious Arab sheikh stepped forward, grabbed my son-in-law by the neck, and said 3 words that made the whole room go silent. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." My name is Ada, and at 61 years old, I thought I had experienced every kind of heartbreak life could offer. I was wrong. The invitation came on a Tuesday, handwritten on cream-colored paper that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. "Mother," it read in Emery's perfect script, "Eli and I would be delighted if you joined us for dinner this Saturday, 7 o'clock sharp. Please dress appropriately." The last line stung, but I ignored it. My daughter hadn't invited me to their Beacon Hill mansion in over 8 months, not since the incident at Easter when I accidentally used the wrong fork for the salad course. Eli had made such a scene about proper etiquette that I'd excused myself early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely false. But this felt different. Maybe Emery was finally ready to bridge the gap that had been widening between us since she married Eli 3 years ago. Maybe she missed her mother. I spent Thursday afternoon at Goodwill, searching through the racks for something that might pass for appropriate in Eli's world. My hands lingered on a navy blue dress with small pearl buttons. It was my size and only had one tiny stain near the hem that I could probably cover with my old black cardigan. $12.50. It would have to do. Saturday evening arrived with an October chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I stood outside their mansion, checking my reflection in the brass doorplate one more time. The house loomed above me, 3 stories of red brick and pristine white trim, with windows that glowed like golden eyes in the darkness. Through the glass, I could see figures moving in elegant silhouettes. Emery's dinner guests were already arriving. I pressed the doorbell and waited, smoothing down my cardigan and trying to ignore the way my stomach twisted with anxiety. The door opened to reveal James, their butler, whose expression remained carefully neutral as he took my worn coat. "Mrs. Patterson," he said with a slight nod. "They're expecting you in the dining room." The hallway stretched before me, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns on the walls. My footsteps echoed despite my efforts to walk quietly, and I found myself gripping my small purse tighter as I approached the dining room doorway. "Mother!" Emery's voice rang out, though her smile seemed forced. She glided toward me in a stunning emerald dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent of $450. "You made it, and you look nice." The pause before nice lasted just long enough to sting. Eli appeared beside her, tall and imposing in his tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled. "Ada," he said, not bothering to hide his once-over glance that clearly found me wanting. "How modest of you to join us." The dining room was filled with their usual crowd, wealthy couples from the country club, business associates, people whose names I could never quite remember but whose judgmental stares I recognized immediately. They looked up from their cocktails with polite but distant smiles, the kind reserved for unwelcome relatives at family gatherings. "Everyone, you remember my mother," Emery announced, though her tone suggested she wished they didn't have to. I managed hellos and handshakes, feeling increasingly out of place as the conversation turned to stock portfolios, European vacations, and renovations on summer homes. I found myself seated at the far end of the table, next to Mrs. Whitmore, who spent most of dinner discussing her poodle's grooming schedule. The meal was exquisite, of course. Multiple courses arrived in perfect succession, each more elaborate than the last. I tried to follow Emery's subtle cues about which utensil to use when, remembering the Easter disaster all too clearly. By the time dessert arrived, some sort of chocolate creation with gold leaf that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, I was beginning to relax. That's when it happened. As James began clearing the dinner plates, Eli suddenly stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The entire table fell silent as his face darkened with rage. "Stop right there," he commanded, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. All eyes turned toward him, then followed his pointing finger directly to me. My blood turned to ice as I realized what he was staring at. "Check her purse," Eli said, his voice deadly calm. "Check it now." "Eli, what are you talking about?" Emery asked, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Your mother," he said, his words dripping with disgust, "has stolen one of our antique silver spoons. I saw her slip it into her purse when she thought no one was looking." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. I felt my face burn with shame and confusion as every pair of eyes turned to stare at me like I was some common criminal caught in the act. "That's not true," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "I would never." "Open your purse," Eli demanded, moving around the table toward me like a predator stalking its prey. "Show everyone what you've taken." My hands shook as I fumbled with the clasp of my small black purse, the same one I'd carried for the past 5 years. I knew there was nothing in there except my wallet, keys, and a small pack of tissues. But the way everyone was staring at me made me doubt my own memory. The silver spoon tumbled out onto my lap with a soft clink that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I stared at it in shock, my mind reeling. How did it get there? When did it— "Get out, thief," Eli roared, his face flushed with righteous anger. "Get out of my house this instant." The laughter started small, just a few snickers from the guests, but it grew until the entire room was filled with the sound of people enjoying my humiliation. Mrs. Whitmore actually clapped her hands together in delight, as if she'd just witnessed the most entertaining dinner theater performance of her life. "Stealing a spoon?" Someone whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "At her age? How desperate can you get?" But it was Emery's voice that shattered what was left of my heart. "That's pathetic. Even for you, Mother." My daughter stood there, her face a mask of cold disappointment, not even trying to defend me or question how the spoon had appeared in my purse. In her eyes, I saw not surprise, but confirmation of every low opinion she'd apparently held about me for years. "Emery," I pleaded, standing on shaking legs. "You have to believe me. I didn't—" "Don't make this worse than it already is," she said, turning away from me as if she couldn't bear to look. "Just go." Eli advanced on me, his hand raised as if he might physically remove me himself, when a voice cut through the chaos like steel through silk. "That will be quite enough." The accent was unmistakably foreign, cultured and commanding in a way that made everyone freeze mid-laugh. I turned to see a man I hadn't noticed before, tall and distinguished with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes like polished onyx. He wore an expensive suit that somehow managed to make Eli's look cheap by comparison, and there was something about the way he held himself that spoke of absolute authority. He moved through the room with fluid grace, the dinner guests parting before him like he was royalty. His dark eyes never left Eli's face as he approached, and I watched my son-in-law's arrogant expression slowly transform into something that looked remarkably like fear. The stranger stopped directly in front of Eli, so close they were almost touching. The room held its collective breath as he leaned in and whispered something in Eli's ear. Just 3 words, spoken so quietly that only Eli could hear them. The effect was immediate and dramatic. All the color drained from Eli's face. His hands began to tremble, and he actually took a step backward, stumbling slightly as if those 3 words had physically struck him. I, Eli stammered, but no complete words came out. The mysterious man straightened, his gaze shifting to me with an expression I couldn't read. There was recognition there, though I was certain I'd never seen him before in my life. Something about his eyes seemed familiar, ancient and knowing, as if he could see straight through to my soul. Without a word, he extended his arm toward me, a gesture both protective and respectful. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice gentle now, completely different from the commanding tone he'd used with Eli. "Perhaps you would allow me to escort you home." I looked around the room one more time. Emery stood frozen by the window, her face pale with confusion. Eli continued to stare at the stranger as if he'd seen a ghost. The dinner guests whispered among themselves, clearly sensing that something significant had just happened, though they couldn't understand what. My legs felt like water, but I managed to nod and accept the stranger's arm. His presence was oddly comforting, like shelter in a storm I hadn't realized I was caught in. As we walked toward the door, I heard Eli's voice behind us, weak and shaky. "Sir, please, I didn't know. If I had realized who she was." But the stranger didn't acknowledge him. He simply guided me through the marble hallway, past the crystal chandeliers, and out into the October night where a sleek black car waited at the curb. The leather seats of the car were softer than anything I'd ever touched, and the silence inside felt like a protective cocoon after the nightmare I'd just escaped. My mysterious rescuer sat beside me, his presence both reassuring and deeply puzzling as his driver navigated the narrow streets of Beacon Hill. I couldn't stop shaking. Not from the cold, but from the shock of what had just happened. The humiliation was still fresh, burning in my chest like acid. But worse than the embarrassment was the look on Emery's face. That cold disappointment, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for me to finally prove what a failure I was. "I didn't steal that spoon," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the gentle hum of the engine. I needed someone to believe me, even if it was a complete stranger. The man turned to face me, and in the soft glow of the streetlights passing by, I could see kindness in his dark eyes. "I know," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. His certainty startled me. "How can you know that? You don't even know me." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "On the contrary, Mrs. Patterson, I know you better than you might think." Something about the way he said my name made my skin prickle. There was familiarity there, recognition, but I was absolutely certain I'd never met this man before. I would have remembered someone like him, the regal bearing, the expensive clothes, the way he commanded respect without saying a word. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice stronger now despite the confusion swirling in my head. "My name is Rashid Al-Mansouri," he said, inclining his head slightly. "And you, Mrs. Patterson, are someone I have been searching for a very long time." The word sent a chill down my spine. "Searching for me? Why? I'm nobody special. I'm just a widow living on a pension of $800 a month trying to get by." "You are far from nobody," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Though I suspect you do not remember why." Remember? What was he talking about? My mind raced through possibilities, but nothing made sense. I lived a quiet, unremarkable life. I worked as a nurse's aide until I retired, took care of my husband Robert until he passed 9 years ago, and now I spent my days reading library books and tending to my small herb garden. What could this elegant man possibly want with someone like me? We were pulling up to my apartment building now, a modest 3-story brick structure in South End that had seen better days. The contrast between this and the mansion we'd just left was stark and embarrassing. I started to reach for the door handle, but Rashid's voice stopped me. "Mrs. Patterson, may I ask you something?" I nodded, still too bewildered to do much else. "Do you ever have dreams about sand? Desert winds? The sound of helicopters overhead?" My hand froze on the door handle. How could he possibly know about the dreams? They'd been coming for years. Fragmented images of endless sand dunes, the acrid smell of smoke, voices shouting in languages I didn't understand. I'd always dismissed them as nonsense, maybe something I'd seen in a movie or on the news. "How did you—" I started, but the words stuck in my throat. "There is much about your past that you do not remember," Rashid said softly. "A past that connects you to my family in ways that run deeper than gratitude, deeper than obligation. You saved something precious to me once, though I suspect the memory is lost to you now. I stared at him, my heart pounding. I've never been anywhere but Boston and the small town in Maine where I grew up. I've never traveled, never been out of the country. You must have me confused with someone else. But even as I said the words, something nagged at me. There were gaps in my memory, periods from my early 20s that felt fuzzy and indistinct. I'd always attributed it to the passage of time, the way details fade when you get older. But what if it was something else? May I show you something? Rashid asked, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an old photograph, its edges yellowed with age, and handed it to me. The image was grainy and slightly blurred, clearly taken in some kind of emergency situation. It showed a young woman in nurse's scrubs, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, crouched beside a hospital bed. She was holding the hand of a small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, whose head was wrapped in bandages. The woman's face was partially turned away from the camera, but something about her posture, the shape of her shoulders, the way she held her head. "That's not," I whispered, but my voice trailed off. The woman in the photo looked exactly like I had at 21. "The boy is my nephew," Rashid said quietly. "His name is Omar." This photograph was taken in 1982 in a field hospital in Lebanon. The woman who saved his life was an American nurse who volunteered with a medical relief organization. 1982, the year that was mostly blank in my memory. The year I supposedly spent finding myself after college, though I could never quite remember what that had involved. The year before I met Robert, before my life settled into the predictable pattern that had carried me through the next 4 decades. "This isn't me," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "I've never been to Lebanon. I've never been anywhere." Rashid studied my face carefully. "You have a scar," he said, "on your left hand near the thumb, small, crescent-shaped. You probably tell people you got it from a kitchen accident." My left hand was hidden in the folds of my cardigan, but I felt the familiar ridge of scar tissue, the mark I'd carried for so long I barely noticed it anymore. I did tell people it was from a kitchen accident, because that was the story that felt right, even though I couldn't actually remember how it happened. "How do you know about that?" I whispered. "Because you got it protecting Omar from falling glass when the hospital was bombed," he said. "You threw yourself over his bed, and a shard cut your hand. The doctors said you probably saved his life." I felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the world had tilted on its axis. This couldn't be true. I would remember something like that, wouldn't I? You don't just forget saving a child's life in a war zone. "I need to go inside," I said abruptly, reaching for the door handle again. "This is all very confusing, and I'm tired." "Of course," Rashid said, but he didn't move to get out. "Mrs. Patterson, there is one more thing. The reason your son-in-law became so frightened when I spoke to him." I paused, remembering Eli's reaction to whatever Rashid had whispered in his ear. The way all the color had drained from his face, the fear in his eyes. "What did you say to him?" Rashid's expression darkened slightly. "I told him who you are. Your real name, before you lost your memory and started over as Ada Patterson." "My real name?" The dizziness got worse, and I gripped the edge of the seat for support. "What are you talking about? Ada is my real name. It's always been my name." "Your name," he said carefully, "is Amira Alzara. And you are not just anyone, Mrs. Patterson. You are a woman my family has been searching for across 3 continents for over 40 years. A woman who disappeared after saving my nephew's life, who was reported killed in the bombing that destroyed the hospital." The words hit me like physical blows. Amira Alzara. Even hearing it made something deep in my chest ache with recognition, though I couldn't understand why. "That's impossible," I managed to say. "I'm not. I've never been." But the dreams flooded back suddenly. Not just images now, but sounds and smells and emotions. the weight of a small child's hand in mine, the acrid smoke that burned my throat, voices calling a name that might have been Amira, might have been mine. "We will speak again soon," Rashid said gently, as if he could see the turmoil in my face. "But for now, rest. Process what I have told you. And perhaps, try to remember." I stumbled out of the car and up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, my mind reeling with questions and possibilities I couldn't quite grasp. As I fumbled with my keys at the door, I heard the soft whisper of expensive tires on asphalt as Rashid's car disappeared into the night. Inside my small apartment, everything looked exactly the same as when I'd left. The threadbare sofa, the small television, the kitchen table where I ate my solitary meals. But somehow it all felt different now, like props on a stage set rather than the authentic life I'd built for myself. I sank onto the couch and stared at the photograph Rashid had left with me, studying every detail of the young woman who might have been me. The more I looked at her, the more familiar she became, until it felt like looking into a mirror that reflected not just my image, but my soul. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to really think about those missing years, those gaps in my memory that I'd always brushed aside. What if they weren't gaps at all? What if they were secrets, buried so deep that even I had forgotten they existed? And what if the quiet, unremarkable life I'd been living was nothing but an elaborate lie I'd been telling myself for 40 years? I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, fragments of memories that might have been dreams flooded my mind. The smell of antiseptic mixed with smoke. Small hands gripping mine with desperate strength. Voices speaking in rapid Arabic while helicopter rotors thundered overhead. By dawn, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at the photograph Rashid had given me. In the harsh morning light streaming through my small window, the resemblance was even more undeniable. The woman in the picture had my eyes, my nose, the same stubborn set to her jaw that I'd inherited from my mother. But I'd never been to Lebanon. I'd never worked in a field hospital. I'd never saved anyone's life. Had I? The knock on my door came at exactly 9 o'clock. I knew it would be Rashid before I even looked through the peephole. He stood in my dingy hallway looking completely out of place in his expensive suit, holding a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Mrs. Patterson," he said when I opened the door, "I hope you slept well." The concern in his voice was genuine, and something about it made my chest tight with emotion. When was the last time anyone had cared whether I slept well? "I didn't sleep at all," I admitted, stepping aside to let him in. "I keep thinking about what you told me, about that photograph. It doesn't make sense." Rashid entered my modest living room and glanced around without judgment, though the contrast between his obvious wealth and my humble surroundings couldn't have been more stark. He set his briefcase on my coffee table with careful precision. "May I sit?" he asked, and I nodded, settling into my worn armchair across from him. "I brought more photographs," he said, opening the briefcase, "and medical records, documents that might help you remember." He spread a collection of items across my coffee table like pieces of a puzzle I'd never known existed. More photographs, some clearer than others. Official-looking papers with letterheads I didn't recognize. And there, at the bottom of the stack, something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a hospital identification badge, yellowed with age and slightly bent. The photo showed the same young woman from the other pictures, but this time she was smiling. Her blonde hair neatly arranged under a nurse's cap. The name printed beneath the photo read, A. Zara, RN, Emergency Relief Corps. A. Zara, I whispered, running my finger over the faded letters. "That's not my name." "Your full name was Amira Louise Zara," Rashid said gently. "You went by your middle name when you returned to America. Louise became Ada over time, a natural progression, but you kept the initial A, perhaps because some part of you remembered." I picked up another photograph, this one showing a group of medical personnel standing in front of a large tent marked with a red cross. The same young woman was there, third from the left, her arm around a colleague. She looked confident, capable, nothing like the uncertain widow I'd become. "Tell me about the hospital," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what happened." Rashid leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "It was August 1982. You had been working with the Emergency Relief Corps for 8 months, treating civilians caught in the crossfire of the Lebanese Civil War. Your specialty was pediatric emergency care." As he spoke, images flashed through my mind like scenes from someone else's movie. Children crying in hospital beds, the constant sound of gunfire in the distance, the weight of responsibility that came with holding someone's life in your hands. "My nephew Omar was brought in after a bombing near his school," Rashid continued. 7 years old, critical head injuries, internal bleeding. The doctors said there was nothing they could do, but you refused to accept that." "I don't remember," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could feel something stirring deep in my memory. A small boy with dark eyes, unconscious and pale, the desperate need to save him no matter what. "You worked on him for 14 hours straight," Rashid said. "You refused to leave his side, even when the other doctors told you to give up. And when the shelling started again and everyone was evacuating, you stayed. You covered his body with your own when the windows exploded." My left hand began to throb, the old scar tissue aching as if responding to the memory. I looked down at the crescent-shaped mark near my thumb, and suddenly I could feel it happening. The sharp bite of glass, the warm wetness of blood, the weight of a child beneath me as the world exploded around us. "Oh my God," I breathed, the memory hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "Omar." His name was Omar. Rashid's eyes widened with hope. "You remember him?" Tears spilled down my cheeks as more fragments fell into place. "He had a toy truck, blue and red. He clutched it even when he was unconscious. I kept it safe for him, promised him he'd get it back when he woke up." "He did wake up," Rashid said softly. "Thanks to you. But by then you were gone." The next photograph showed the aftermath of the bombing. The hospital was nothing but rubble and twisted metal, bodies being pulled from the wreckage. And there, on a list of the missing and presumed dead, was my name. Amira El Zahra, age 21, United States citizen. "I was supposed to be dead," I said, staring at the official report. "The explosion threw you clear of the building," Rashid explained. "You were found 3 days later by American forces, unconscious, with severe head trauma and no identification. You were listed as Jane Doe and evacuated to a military hospital in Germany." I picked up another document, a medical report from the Army hospital. Severe concussion, retrograde amnesia. Patient claims to remember only her first name and that she's American. No family contacted. "The amnesia was real," I said, reading the clinical notes. "I really couldn't remember." "When you recovered enough to travel, the military flew you back to the United States," Rashid said. "You were processed as an unidentified civilian and eventually placed with a social services program for displaced persons. That's how you became Ada Patterson. Ada from your middle name Louise becoming Lou becoming Ada, and Patterson from the social worker who helped you start over." The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture of a life I'd forgotten I'd ever lived. "Robert," I said suddenly. "My husband. I met him at the community center where they placed me. He was volunteering, helping people like me adjust to starting over." "A good man," Rashid said. "He gave you a stable life, a new beginning. But he never knew who you really were, did he?" I shook my head. I couldn't tell him what I didn't remember, and after a while it seemed easier to just let the past stay buried. But there was more in the briefcase. Rashid pulled out a thick folder and set it on the table with reverence. "There is something else you need to know, Amira. Something about why finding you was so important to my family. He opened the folder to reveal a bank statement from an institution I'd never heard of. The account name read, A.L. Zara Memorial Fund. The balance made me dizzy. $15,200,000. What is this? I whispered. When we thought you had died, Rashid said, my family established a fund in your honor. Every year we added to it, money that should have been yours. Money we saved because we couldn't bear to spend what belonged to the woman who saved Omar's life. I stared at the number, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. $15 million. A fortune beyond anything I'd ever imagined. My nephew Omar grew up to become a doctor, Rashid continued. He specializes in pediatric neurosurgery now, inspired by the nurse who saved his life. He has helped hundreds of children, performed surgeries that seemed impossible. Every life he saved, every child who went home to their parents, exists because of what you did in that hospital 42 years ago. The weight of it was overwhelming. All those years I'd struggled to make ends meet on my small pension, worried about medical bills and heating costs, never knowing that somewhere in the world, a fortune sat waiting for me. But there's more, Rashid said, his voice growing harder. There is the matter of your son-in-law, Eli Richardson. Just hearing Eli's name made my stomach clench with remembered humiliation. What about him? Rashid pulled out another folder, this one considerably thinner. 3 months ago, someone contacted our family's legal representatives in Boston. They claimed to have information about Amira Zara, said they could prove she was still alive for a finder's fee of $50,000. My blood ran cold. Eli? The contact was anonymous, but the investigation it triggered led us directly to you. Someone has known who you are for quite some time, Mrs. Patterson. Someone who chose to use that information not to help you reclaim your identity, but to profit from keeping you in the dark. The betrayal cut deeper than the humiliation at dinner had. Eli hadn't just stumbled across my past. He'd been hiding it from me, using it somehow for his own gain. But how long had he known? And why hadn't he told Emery? The 3 words I whispered to him last night, Rashid said, were, "We know everything." I wanted him to understand that his game was over, that we had found you despite his attempts to control the situation. I felt sick, remembering the fear in Eli's eyes when Rashid had confronted him. He set me up last night, didn't he? The spoon in my purse. I believe so, Rashid said, though proving it would be difficult. What matters now is that you know the truth about who you are and what is rightfully yours. I looked around my tiny apartment with new eyes. The second-hand furniture, the kitchen where I counted every penny, the stack of bills on my counter that I juggled each month like a complicated puzzle. All of it unnecessary. All these years of struggle, when I could have been living with dignity. But more than the money, it was the knowledge that my life had mattered that shook me to my core. I wasn't just a failed mother who'd disappointed her daughter. I was someone who had saved lives, who had made a difference in the world. What happens now? I asked. Rashid smiled, the first truly warm expression I'd seen from him. Now, Amira Louise Zara, you reclaim your life. All of it. The money, the recognition, the respect that was always yours, but was stolen from you by circumstances and by people who should have protected you instead of exploiting you. He stood and moved toward the door, then paused. There is one more thing. Omar? He is a grown man now, 49 years old, with children of his own, but he has never forgotten the American nurse who saved his life. He would very much like to meet you again, when you are ready. After Rashid left, I sat alone with the photographs and documents spread before me like pieces of my reclaimed identity. The woman in those pictures wasn't a failure or a disappointment. She was a hero who had lost herself and spent 40 years trying to find her way home. The question now was, what was I going to do about it? 3 days after Rashid's revelation, I found myself sitting in the most expensive law office I'd ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Boston Harbor, and the mahogany conference table was larger than my entire living room. But what struck me most was how different I felt sitting there. Not like the poor widow who'd been humiliated at her daughter's dinner party, but like someone who belonged in rooms like this. Rashid sat across from me, along with two lawyers who'd flown in from New York specifically to handle my case. The mountain of documents between us told a story that grew more disturbing with each page. "The timeline is quite clear," said Margaret Chen, the lead attorney. "Mr. Richardson first contacted our investigative firm in March of this year. He claimed to have discovered through genealogy research that his mother-in-law might be connected to a missing person case involving our clients." I felt nauseous. March. That was 7 months ago, just after Emery had mentioned in passing that I'd been acting forgetful lately and maybe should see a doctor about my memory. I'd brushed off her concern, not realizing it had triggered something in Eli's mind. "He specifically asked about any reward money for information leading to your whereabouts," Margaret continued. "When we told him there was no reward, but that we would be grateful for any legitimate information, he became evasive." Rashid leaned forward, his expression darkening. "Tell her about the blackmail attempt." The second lawyer, a thin man named David Pratt, opened another folder. "In May, Mr. Richardson contacted us again. This time he claimed you were suffering from dementia and would need significant medical care. He suggested that any family assets or inheritance might be better managed through a trust, with him as the designated guardian." My hands clenched in my lap. Eli had been planning to have me declared incompetent, to steal not just my identity, but my mental capacity as well. "He had no legal standing to make such a claim," Margaret said quickly. "But he seemed to believe that once we confirmed your identity, there would be significant financial benefits that he could control through your daughter." "Show her the recordings," Rashid said quietly. David pulled out a small device and set it on the table. "Mr. Richardson didn't know that our initial phone calls were recorded as part of our standard security procedures. You should hear this." He pressed play, and Eli's voice filled the elegant conference room, tinny but unmistakably his. "Look, I'm not asking for much here. Just a finder's fee and maybe some consideration when it comes to managing the old lady's affairs. She's not getting any younger, and frankly, she's already showing signs of confusion. My wife doesn't have the business experience to handle significant assets, but I do." The casual way he dismissed me as the old lady made my blood boil. But it was what came next that truly shocked me. The truth is, she's been a burden on our family for years, always needing financial help, never quite fitting in with our social circle. If there's money involved here, it would be better for everyone if it were managed properly. She might even be happier in a nice facility where she could get the care she needs. I felt tears stinging my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage. All those times I'd felt like an outsider at Emery's house, all those subtle comments about my clothes or my mannerisms. Eli had been laying groundwork, making me seem incompetent and burdensome. "There's more," David said, his voice gentle but firm. "This recording is from July." Eli's voice again, but this time more agitated. "You're taking too long with this investigation. I need to know what we're dealing with here. My mother-in-law is starting to ask questions about her past, talking about strange dreams. If she remembers something before you people get involved officially, it could complicate things." Margaret paused the recording. That's when we knew something was wrong. Legitimate family members don't typically worry about the subject of an investigation remembering their own past. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice hoarse with emotion. "We accelerated our investigation," Rashid said, "and we started watching your family more closely. We needed to understand what kind of people we were dealing with before we approached you." The final piece of evidence was a stack of printed emails between Eli and someone named Marcus Whitley, apparently a private investigator Eli had hired independently. I read the first email with growing horror. "Marcus, need you to dig deeper into Ada Patterson's background. specifically any gaps in her employment history from 1982-1983. Also want you to check if there are any legal ways to have someone declared mentally incompetent in Massachusetts. Budget is $10K. This needs to stay completely confidential. ER. The response was equally disturbing. Eli found some interesting gaps in her medical records from early 80s. Looks like she was treated for head trauma and amnesia at a military hospital in Germany, then processed through a refugee assistance program. No family contacts on file. As for mental competency, you'd need medical documentation of cognitive decline and court proceedings. Happy to research options if you want to proceed. MW. He's been planning this for months, I whispered, staring at the dates on the emails. While I was worrying about disappointing Emery, he was trying to figure out how to steal my life. It gets worse, Margaret said softly. She pulled out one final document, a draft legal petition. This was found on Mr. Richardson's computer during our investigation. He was preparing to file for emergency guardianship over you, claiming you were a danger to yourself due to advancing dementia. I read the petition with growing disbelief. Eli had fabricated incidents of me being confused, getting lost, forgetting to pay bills. He'd even claimed I'd left the stove on multiple times and nearly caused a fire, something that had never happened. The plan was elegant in its cruelty, Rashid explained. Once he had you declared incompetent, he would gain control of any assets or inheritance. When we contacted him to confirm your identity, he would have been positioned as your legal guardian, able to make all decisions about your finances. But why? I asked, though I was starting to understand. He's already wealthy. Not as wealthy as he appears, Margaret said. Our background check revealed that Mr. Richardson has significant debts. His business ventures have been failing for the past 2 years. He owes approximately $800,000 to various creditors and has been hiding his financial problems from your daughter. The pieces were falling into place now. Eli needed money desperately, but couldn't let Emery know how badly he'd mismanaged their finances. When he stumbled across clues about my past, he saw an opportunity not just for financial gain, but for a solution to his problems that would make him look like the responsible family member taking care of his confused mother-in-law. The spoon at dinner, I said suddenly. He planted it in my purse to make me look like I was deteriorating mentally. Almost certainly, David agreed. If you had reacted with confusion or denial, it would have supported his narrative that you were becoming unstable. He probably has other incidents planned as well. I thought about all the small cruelties I'd endured from Eli over the years, the way he'd made me feel unwelcome in my own daughter's home. It hadn't been personal dislike. It had been systematic undermining, designed to make me appear unfit and unreliable. What about Emery? I asked, dreading the answer. Does she know? Rashid's expression softened with sympathy. We don't believe so. The evidence suggests she's as much a victim of his manipulation as you are. He's been very careful to control information, to make her see you through his lens rather than her own experience. That almost made it worse. My daughter hadn't rejected me out of cruelty, but because her husband had spent years poisoning her perception of me. Every time I'd felt hurt by her coldness, every moment I'd wondered what I'd done wrong as a mother, Eli had been whispering in her ear, shaping her reality to serve his agenda. The question now, Margaret said, is what you want to do about it. We have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges for fraud and attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person. We could also file civil suits for damages. I stared out the window at the harbor, watching boats navigate the choppy water. For 40 years, I'd lived a quiet life, avoiding conflict, accepting whatever treatment came my way. But I wasn't that powerless woman anymore. I was Amira Zara, and I had saved lives. I had faced bombs and blood and chaos, and I had survived. I don't want to destroy him, I said finally. But I won't let him continue to manipulate my daughter or anyone else. What do you have in mind? Rashid asked. I turned back to face them, feeling strength flow through me like electricity. I want him to confess. I want Emery to hear the truth from his own mouth. And then I want him gone from our lives, permanently. Margaret smiled. That can be arranged. In fact, we have an idea that might accomplish all of those goals. As they outlined their plan, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the power to control my own destiny. Eli had underestimated me, just like everyone else in my life. He'd seen a poor, confused widow and thought he could easily manipulate her. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would use Eli's own greed against him, offering him exactly what he thought he wanted, while ensuring he revealed his true nature to the one person whose opinion mattered most, my daughter. When do we start? I asked. Rashid checked his watch. Tomorrow evening. I'll arrange for Emery to be present when Mr. Richardson receives some very interesting news about your inheritance. As I left the law office that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not just because of the money, though $15 million would certainly change my circumstances, but because I finally understood who I was. Not a burden, not a disappointment, but a woman who had made a difference in the world and was about to make one again. Eli Richardson had spent months planning to steal my life. Tomorrow, I would show him what happened to people who underestimated Amira Zara. The game was about to change, and this time, I was the one holding all the cards. The call came at exactly 6 o'clock on Thursday evening, just as Rashid and I had planned. I sat in my small apartment, listening to Eli's voice on the speakerphone, trying to keep the satisfaction out of my voice as he took our carefully laid bait. Ada, he said, and I could hear the forced warmth that had never been there before. I'm so glad you picked up. I've been thinking about what happened at dinner the other night, and I owe you an apology. An apology. After months of planning to steal my identity and have me declared incompetent, he was apologizing for the public humiliation that was probably the least of his crimes. Have you, Eli? I kept my voice neutral, elderly, the same tone I'd used for years when he'd made his cutting remarks. Yes, absolutely. Emery and I have been talking, and we think there might have been a misunderstanding about the spoon situation. You know how chaotic dinner parties can get. A misunderstanding. As if the antique silver spoon had somehow leaped into my purse of its own accord. But I played along, just as Margaret Chen had coached me. That's very generous of you, I said, though I'm still confused about how it got there. These things happen, Eli said smoothly. The important thing is that we're family, and family sticks together. In fact, I have some wonderful news that I'd like to share with you in person. Would you be available to come over for dinner tomorrow? Just the three of us this time. Very casual. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Eli thought he was setting a trap, but he was walking directly into ours. I'd like that, I said. What time? 7 o'clock? And Ada. Please don't mention this conversation to anyone else just yet. I want it to be a surprise for Emery. Of course he did. He wanted to control the narrative, just like he'd been doing for years. After I hung up, I looked at Rashid, who had been listening from my kitchen. He took the bait completely. The greed made him predictable, Rashid said. Now comes the difficult part. The difficult part was what we had planned for Friday evening. Margaret and David would be waiting in a van outside Emery's house, recording everything through the wire I'd be wearing. At precisely 7:30, Rashid would arrive at the door with documents that would force Eli to reveal his true intentions. But first, I had something else to do. Friday afternoon, I drove to the boutique in Back Bay that Margaret had recommended. The sales associate, a woman about Emery's age named Sarah, looked surprised when I walked in wearing my usual thrift store cardigan and sensible shoes. I need a dress, I told her. Something that says I'm not the same woman I was last week. Sarah's expression shifted as she really looked at me. Not at my clothes, but at my face, my posture, the way I was holding myself. Something had changed in me since learning the truth about my past, and apparently it showed. "What's the occasion?" she asked. "I'm reclaiming my life," I said simply. An hour later, I left the boutique wearing a navy blue dress that actually fit properly, with a matching jacket that made me look competent and elegant. The total cost was $450, exactly what I paid in rent each month, but it was worth every penny to see the respect in Sarah's eyes when I tried it on. I also stopped at a salon, where they styled my hair in a way that emphasized my cheekbones and made me look 10 years younger. By the time I arrived at Emery's house Friday evening, I looked like the successful woman I was about to become, not the poor relative they'd grown accustomed to pitying. Emery answered the door, and her expression told me everything. She almost didn't recognize me. "Mother?" she said, blinking in surprise. "You look different." "I feel different," I said, stepping into the marble foyer that had intimidated me just a week ago. Tonight it felt like any other room. Eli appeared from the living room, clearly expecting the same dowdy widow who'd been humiliated at his dinner party. When he saw me, his smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Ada, you look lovely," he said, but I could hear the question in his voice. Where had I gotten the money for new clothes? What had changed? "Thank you," I said simply, following them into the dining room where James had set the table for 3. Dinner was an elaborate affair, much more formal than Eli had promised over the phone. He'd clearly wanted to impress me, to butter me up for whatever he was planning to reveal. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here he was, trying to manipulate me with kindness after months of subtle cruelty. "So," Eli said as James served the main course. "I mentioned I had some news to share." I nodded, cutting into my salmon with deliberate care. Under my dress, the small recording device Margaret had given me captured every word. "As you know, I have some contacts in the financial world," Eli continued. "Well, one of them reached out to me recently with some very interesting information about your background." Emery looked puzzled. "What kind of information?" Eli smiled, the expression of a man who thought he was about to win the lottery. "It seems our Ada here might be entitled to some kind of inheritance or settlement from overseas. Something related to her work as a young woman." "I never worked overseas," I said, playing my part perfectly. "I've never even been outside the country." "Well, that's where it gets interesting," Eli said, his excitement building. "My contact thinks you might have forgotten some things due to, well, your age and everything, memory issues. But if we can establish your identity properly, there could be significant money involved." Emery frowned. "Memory issues? Mother doesn't have memory issues." But Eli was too focused on what he saw as his prize to notice her defensive tone. "Oh, sweetheart, she's had some confusion lately. Remember when she forgot about dinner last month? And that time she seemed lost when she came to visit?" I watched my daughter's face as Eli spoke, seeing the doubt creep into her eyes. He'd been doing this for months, planting seeds of concern about my mental state, and she'd absorbed it without realizing. "The point is," Eli continued, "we'll need to set up some kind of trust or guardianship arrangement to handle the money properly. For her own protection, of course. I'd be happy to manage it, make sure she's taken care of." And there it was. The confession we needed, recorded clearly for posterity. "How much money are we talking about?" Emery asked, and I could see the conflict in her face. Concern for me warring with curiosity about this supposed inheritance. "My contact estimates it could be anywhere from $5 to $15 million, Eli said, unable to keep the greed out of his voice. "Maybe more." Emery's fork clattered against her plate. $15 million? How is that possible? Before Eli could answer, the doorbell rang. James appeared in the doorway with a slightly confused expression. "Sir, there's a gentleman here who insists on speaking with Mrs. Patterson. He says it's urgent and relates to some legal documents." Eli's face went white. This wasn't part of his plan. "Show him in," I said calmly, before Eli could object. Rashid entered the dining room carrying a leather briefcase, looking every inch the powerful international businessman. He nodded politely to Emery and completely ignored Eli. "Mrs. Patterson," he said formally, "I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but there are some documents that require your immediate attention." "What documents?" Eli demanded, his voice tight with panic. Rashid finally looked at him, and the contempt in his eyes was unmistakable. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced, Mr. Richardson. I am Rashid Al-Mansouri, representing the Al-Mansouri Family Trust. We've been in communication with your legal representatives regarding Mrs. Patterson's inheritance." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Eli's mind racing, trying to understand how his carefully laid plans had suddenly spun out of his control. "I'm sorry," Emery said, "but what inheritance? And how do you know my mother?" Rashid opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of photographs, the same ones he'd shown me earlier. "Your mother, Mrs. Richardson, is not who she appears to be. Her real name is Amira Zara, and 42 years ago she saved the life of my nephew in a field hospital in Lebanon." He spread the photographs across the dining table, and I watched Emery's face as she recognized the young woman in the pictures. "That's you," she whispered, looking at me with wide eyes. "But you've never been to Lebanon. You've never left the country." "Your mother suffered severe amnesia after a bombing," Rashid explained. "She lost all memory of her previous life and was processed through a refugee assistance program under a false identity. We've been searching for her for 4 decades. Eli found his voice, though it came out strangled. "How did you find her?" Rashid's smile was cold as winter. "Someone contacted our investigators claiming to have information about Amira Zara's whereabouts. Someone who demanded $50,000 for that information and suggested that Mrs. Patterson might need a guardian to manage any inheritance she might receive." The color drained from Eli's face completely. Emery looked between her husband and Rashid, understanding beginning to dawn. "Eli?" she said slowly. "What is he talking about?" Rashid pulled out another document, the recorded transcript of Eli's phone calls. "Perhaps Mr. Richardson would like to explain how he discovered your mother's true identity and why he chose to keep it secret while planning to have her declared mentally incompetent." "That's not," Eli started, but his voice failed him. "We have recordings," Rashid said simply. "We have emails. We have evidence of your attempts to establish guardianship over Mrs. Patterson based on fabricated claims of dementia. Would you like me to play them for your wife?" Emery stood up so quickly her chair nearly toppled. You knew about this inheritance and you didn't tell us." "It's not what you think," Eli said desperately. "I was trying to protect her. Protect both of you. Ada's been showing signs of confusion, and I was worried." "Stop lying," I said, my voice cutting through his excuses like a blade. "There are no signs of confusion, Eli. There never were. You made them up because you needed money and you thought you could steal mine." I stood up, feeling the power of my true identity flowing through me. "You planted that spoon in my purse to make me look unstable. You've spent months telling my daughter that I was deteriorating mentally. You hired private investigators to research my background so you could claim my inheritance through guardianship fraud." Emery sank back into her chair, staring at her husband as if she'd never seen him before. "The spoon? You put the spoon in her purse?" Eli's shoulders slumped in defeat. The carefully constructed facade he'd maintained for years was crumbling around him. "I needed the money," he said finally. "The business is failing. We owe hundreds of thousands in debts. When I found out about her past, it seemed like the answer to everything. By having my mother declared incompetent?" Emery's voice was barely controlled fury. "By stealing from her?" "I wasn't stealing," Eli protested weakly. "I was going to take care of her, make sure she was comfortable. She would never have known the difference." The casual cruelty of that statement hung in the air like smoke. He'd been planning to steal my life, my identity, my dignity, and he genuinely believed I was too stupid, or too far gone to notice. Rashid closed his briefcase with a sharp snap. "Mrs. Patterson, your inheritance has been confirmed and transferred to accounts under your control. $15,200,000, plus accumulated interest over the past 40 years. Emery made a small sound of shock, but I barely heard her. I was staring at Eli, watching the last of his arrogance crumble as he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. "You're going to leave," I told him, my voice steady and calm. "You're going to pack your things and go tonight. You'll file for divorce and give Emery whatever she wants. And if you ever try to contact me or manipulate my daughter again, I will use my considerable resources to destroy you completely." Eli opened his mouth to argue, but one look at Rashid's face stopped him cold. "The recordings of your conversations with our investigators will remain confidential," Rashid added. "As long as you cooperate fully with Mrs. Patterson's requests, if you force us to take legal action, everything will become public record." The threat was clear. Eli's reputation, his business connections, his entire social standing depended on his compliance. "Emery," he started, turning to his wife with desperate eyes. But my daughter was looking at me now, really looking at me, perhaps for the first time in years. "Get out," she said quietly. "Just get out." 3 months later, I stood in the garden of my new house in Cambridge, watching the morning sun filter through the maple trees I had planted along the back fence. The house wasn't a mansion. I'd deliberately chosen something comfortable rather than ostentatious, but it was mine in a way that my little apartment had never been. Every room reflected choices I'd made freely, without counting pennies or worrying about landlords. The doorbell chimed, and I smiled, knowing who it would be. Every Saturday morning for the past 6 weeks, Emery had come for coffee. It had taken her time to process everything that had happened. The revelation about my past, Eli's betrayal, the divorce proceedings that were still ongoing. But slowly, carefully, we were rebuilding something that might actually be stronger than what we'd had before. "Mother," she said as I opened the door, and I still felt a small thrill every time she said it without that slight edge of embarrassment that used to creep into her voice. "Amira," I corrected gently, as I had been doing for weeks now. "I think it's time you started using my real name." She smiled, and I could see she was trying, even though 40 years of calling me Ada was a hard habit to break. "Amira, how are you settling in?" I led her to the kitchen, where I'd already prepared her favorite coffee, Ethiopian beans that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week, but that now seemed like a reasonable indulgence. The kitchen was spacious but warm, with windows that looked out onto the garden where I'd started growing herbs again, something I'd forgotten I loved until I had the space to remember. "I had an interesting call yesterday," I told her as we settled at the breakfast table. "From Omar." Emery's expression brightened. Over the past months, she'd heard me talk about Dr. Omar al-Mansouri, the little boy whose life I'd saved and who was now one of Boston's most respected pediatric neurosurgeons. She'd even met him briefly when he'd flown in from Chicago to see me last month. "What did he say?" "He wants me to speak at a medical conference next year, about trauma nursing in conflict zones." I paused, still getting used to the idea that my experiences were worth sharing. "He thinks my perspective might help young doctors understand the importance of never giving up on a patient. For so many years, I'd thought of myself as someone who'd failed at the important things: marriage, motherhood, making a difference in the world. Learning that I'd actually saved lives, that my work had mattered enough for someone to spend 40 years trying to find me, had changed something fundamental in how I saw myself. "Will you do it?" Emery asked. "I think I will," I said. "It feels important to honor that part of my life, the part I lost for so long." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping our coffee and watching cardinals at the bird feeder I'd hung outside the window. It was still strange, having enough money that I didn't need to worry about heating bills or grocery budgets, but I was learning to enjoy the small luxuries that came with security. "I have some news too," Emery said eventually, and something in her tone made me look up. The divorce is final. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. The past 3 months had been difficult for her. Not just the end of her marriage, but the realization that the man she'd loved had been systematically manipulating her perception of her own mother. Eli had moved back to New York, ostensibly to be closer to family, but really because his reputation in Boston was irreparable once word of his financial problems had gotten out. "How do you feel?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time in years, I feel like I can think clearly. I keep remembering things, conversations where Eli would make little comments about your mental state, times when he'd discourage me from inviting you over or visiting you. I was so blind to it." "You weren't blind," I said firmly. "You trusted someone you loved. That's not a character flaw, Emery. It's what people in healthy relationships do." "But I should have seen it. I should have defended you." Her voice broke slightly. "All those years, I let him make me think you were less than you are. I'm so sorry, Mother. Amira. I'm so sorry for all of it." This was the conversation I'd been waiting for, the one we'd been circling around for weeks as we slowly rebuilt our relationship. I'd known it would come eventually, but I still wasn't entirely prepared for the raw pain in my daughter's voice. "You have nothing to apologize for," I said. "Nothing at all. You were manipulated by someone who was very good at manipulation. The only person responsible for Eli's actions is Eli. But I hurt you. I know I did. All those years of being cold, of keeping you at arm's length." I stood up and moved to her side of the table, pulling her into a hug that felt long overdue. For a moment, she was the little girl I remembered, before life and loss and Eli's poison had created distance between us. "Listen to me," I said, pulling back to look at her face. "I spent 40 years not knowing who I really was, thinking I was just a failed nurse's aide who disappointed her daughter. But I wasn't a failure, and neither were you. We were both doing the best we could with what we knew at the time." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I just wish I could make up for it somehow." "You already are," I said simply. "Every Saturday morning when you come here, every time you call just to talk, every time you look at me like you're proud to be my daughter, you're making up for it." Later that afternoon, after Emery had left, I found myself in my study, looking at the framed photograph on my desk. It was a new print of that old hospital picture, the one Rashid had first shown me. But now it was displayed alongside others. Photos of me with Omar and his family when they'd visited, pictures of Emery and me at the housewarming party she'd thrown for me, even one of Rashid and me at the elegant restaurant where he'd taken me to celebrate the finalization of my inheritance. The money had changed my circumstances, but it hadn't changed who I was. I still preferred quiet evenings at home to elaborate social events. I still found joy in simple things like growing herbs and feeding birds. But now I had choices, and that made all the difference. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a Boston number I didn't recognize. "Hello? Mrs. Patterson? Ms. Zara? This is Janet Murphy from the Refugee Assistance Center downtown." I remembered Janet, a social worker I'd met when I'd started volunteering at the center last month. Working with refugees and displaced persons felt like coming full circle, using my own experience with memory loss and starting over to help others navigate similar challenges. "Hello, Janet. What can I do for you?" "We have a situation I thought you might be able to help with. A woman came in today, elderly, clearly traumatized. She says she can't remember her name or where she's from, but she speaks English with an American accent. The doctors think it might be stress-related amnesia, but she's afraid and won't trust anyone." I closed my eyes, remembering what it felt like to wake up in a hospital bed with no idea who I was or how I'd gotten there. "I'll be right there." An hour later, I sat in a small counseling room at the center, across from a woman who looked to be about my age. Her gray hair was matted, her clothes dirty, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much trauma. But when she looked at me, I saw a flicker of recognition, not of me personally, but of someone who might understand. "Hello," I said gently. "My name is Amira. I used to forget things too." She didn't speak at first, just watched me with wary eyes. But gradually, as I told her my own story, carefully, without overwhelming details, I saw her shoulders relax slightly. "You really forgot who you were?" she asked finally, her voice hoarse. "For 40 years, I said. But I built a new life, and when my memories came back, I didn't lose what I'd built. I just added to it. It was after dark when I finally drove home, but I felt energized rather than tired. Helping someone else navigate the confusion and fear I'd experienced gave meaning to my own journey in a way that simply having money never could. Back in my kitchen, I made myself dinner, a simple pasta dish with herbs from my garden, and sat down with the book I'd been reading. But my attention kept drifting to the window, where I could see the lights of Boston in the distance. Tomorrow was Sunday, which meant I'd probably get a call from Omar, who'd made checking on me a weekly ritual. Rashid would likely stop by sometime next week with updates from his family's charitable foundation, where I'd recently agreed to serve as an advisor for their North American medical relief programs. And Emery would be back next Saturday for coffee and conversation that grew easier and more honest with each passing week. For most of my adult life, I'd felt like I was waiting for something. For Robert to come home from work, for Emery to call, for some sign that my life had meaning beyond just getting through each day. I'd measured my worth by other people's approval, other people's needs, other people's definitions of success. But sitting in my own kitchen, in my own house, surrounded by evidence of choices I'd made freely and relationships I'd built authentically, I realized I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. This was my life, full and complete, and entirely my own. The woman I'd been at 21 had saved a child's life in a war zone and lost herself in the process. The woman I'd become at 61 had found herself again and was using that strength to help others. Both women were me. Both stories were true, and both had value. I'd spent so many years thinking I wasn't enough. Not a good enough mother, not an important enough person, not worthy of love or respect. But I was enough. I'd always been enough. It had just taken me 61 years and a journey halfway around the world to remember it. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, dusting the herbs I'd planted and the bird feeder that would attract cardinals in the morning. Inside, I was warm and safe and home. Not in the building, but in my own skin, in my own story, in the knowledge that every choice I'd made had led me exactly where I was supposed to be. I thought about Eli sometimes, wondered if he'd learned anything from losing everything he'd thought mattered. But mostly, I didn't think about him at all. Some people deserved second chances, and some people deserved to be forgotten. The wisdom to know the difference was perhaps the most valuable gift my inheritance had brought me. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me had silver hair and lines around her eyes, but she stood straight and smiled easily. She looked like someone who'd lived fully, who'd faced challenges and survived them, who'd found her way home after a very long journey. She looked like Amira Zara. She looked like me. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.